Now, on a Saturday, we had the very good fortune to have the time of Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist at the MB Fund, MB Super, and most importantly, one of the main drivers of macrobusiness.com.au. If you want a different take on the regular fare served up as economic/finance news, I cannot recommend the work at macrobusiness.com.au high enough. Have a look. It's worth it. And Leith Van Onselen is on the line. How are you, mate?
Good, thanks, Luke. Glad to hear your voice again.
Nice to hear yours again. I've missed our chats on a Saturday, but I'm glad we're back together again today. Let's start off with Australia's housing crisis of lies. I love the way you put all of this. Interestingly, there's a story in the Telegraph today, mate, in Sydney that says there are pockets of Sydney where the cost of dwellings, generally apartments, are a lot less than what they were a decade ago. Now, they point out that I think PropTrack did this analysis. Some of those areas are heavily built out areas that didn't look like that maybe a decade or two ago. And some areas where there are houses that are cheaper, well, they've gone from, the large blocks to the subdivisions and the much smaller blocks. So maybe there's something to this. I don't know if it's supply, but I do know you and I have talked forever about if you can do something about demand, that would involve reducing immigration. You get probably a decent outcome and a lot more quickly as well. Tell me about this story entitled Australia's Housing Crisis of Lies.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Luke. So earlier this week, a survey of 49 so-called leading economists, they're all basically university-type economists predominantly, released a survey and basically pinned the blame for Australia's housing crisis on the supply side. So basically said, we've got to ease planning, blah, 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 et cetera, all the usual stuff you hear. But curiously, only 6% of the 40-odd economists surveyed said that we should restrain immigration. So, try and lower immigration as a solution. Whereas 14% said that we should actually fast track immigration of home builders. So they effectively want to import more migrants to build homes for migrants. And, the ridiculous thing about this is that, once again, it's been pinned as purely a supply issue and not related to demand, despite the fact that Australia's population has grown like a science experiment and is projected to continue to do so.
Yeah.
And in a similar vein, two housing reports were released this week from an organisation called Everybody's Home, which always complains about lack of housing and, the impact it's having on people, as well as another mob called the Blueprint Institute, a new think tank. And they also denied that excessive immigration is a factor in Australia's housing crisis, which I think is just absolutely absurd. The fact of the matter is, despite what you hear, Australia's actually completed more homes, relative to our size than almost every other developed country in the world over the past several decades. We've also have more construction workers per capita than just about every other developed country. But the reason why we've still got this housing shortage is because our population has grown far more aggressively than just about every other major developed nation. So, for example, between 2005 and 2023, Australia's population grew by 32%. That's against the OECD average of 12%. And the next biggest after that was New Zealand, which was 26%, and then Canada at 24%. So we have absolutely blown the lights off with population growth. We've had 8.3 million population increase this century. And according to the Intergenerational Report, we're going to have another 13.5 million people in only 39 years. So that's like adding another Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane to Australia's current population. And that's going to require about 6 million homes.
Jeez.
And the thing about it is that I find this irritating is that obviously running such a high population growth policy means that your demand is more likely to forever outstrip supply. And we're seeing that right now. We've had literally 1 million net migrants arrive in 2 years. Australia's population grew by about 660,000 last year, and we only built about 170,000 homes. Now, Blind Freddy can see that that's basically a problem. We're growing the population. We're importing more renters than we can build homes for renters. It's plain for everybody to see.
Yep.
And yet these, 40-odd so-called expert economists, these two housing groups release reports, can't even see the elephant in the room. They won't acknowledge that perhaps Australia should slow its immigration rate to a level that's below its capacity to build homes and infrastructure. Otherwise, we're going to forever be behind. And it's just the sort of gaslighting that we see over and over again, whereby you're not allowed to mention the immigration rate when you talk about housing because it's off limits.
Yeah.
And you've got to talk about everything else
Yeah.
when the average person in the street can see the obvious.
Well, I remember some time ago saying, well, at least this time they're not running the racist line against anyone that is suggesting the common sense that you're suggesting. But over the couple of months, that certainly made its way into the debate. And Leith, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I also always say this is not about where people come from or what they believe in or the colour of their skin or whatever their other lifestyle choices are. This is an issue of mathematics. If you're going to have 1 million people in a couple of years and all you can offer is 100,000 or 200,000 new dwellings, well, where the hell are they going to live? I'll tell you where they'll live. They'll live in a bloody ute or in a tent or in someone else's place. And it's completely wrong to say, other than the obvious, as you say, the population goes up by 1 million and that both sides of politics do it. Did we learn at the last election that within a couple of years we'd add another 1 million to the people living here? No bloody way. They never tell you up front. It just happens and, you get gaslit, as you said, when you argue the point. It's an appalling state of affairs. But I really do sense that people are understanding that and are more supportive of the common sense stance that people like you and I and others are putting. Do you think that?
Yeah, absolutely. And nobody's saying we should have zero migration.
Exactly.
We just need to slow it down to a level that's sustainable and a level that is below the nation's capacity to build homes and infrastructure. And if we do that, we won't forever be running behind, which is what we're doing at the moment. And anybody who lives in Sydney, or as I do in Melbourne, has seen it with their own two eyes. And anybody who's old enough, just think back to the Sydney Olympics at the turn of the century and then think about Sydney now.
Yeah.
And ask yourself, which was a more livable Sydney? The one you had at the turn of the century around about the time of the Olympics or the one you have now? And I'd argue that pretty much 9 people out of 10 would say that it was better back then.
Yeah. Question without notice, what do you think happens with interest rates next? Should we imagine that pressure of all sorts on the Reserve Bank will make sure they don't increase rates? We saw Commonwealth yesterday make an adjustment downwards to their rate, their I think fixed rates, maybe one or two others, to new lenders. Well, what do you or how are you assessing the current interest rate environment?
Yeah, look, I think they're going to stay on. I don't think they're going to hike rates again. I think that's a very, very low probability. But I also think that we're not going to see rate cuts until next year now. So I think since about December last year, I was calling the second half of this year, but I think that's been put on ice. So the bad news is pretty much most other countries now are cutting rates. So New Zealand's cutting their rates, Canada's cutting their rates. Unfortunately, we're going to be on hold, looks like, for longer, which means that we're probably not going to see rate cuts until the first half of next year now.
Now, through the week again and before that, there's obviously a concerted campaign by the big university lobby to make sure that all of us understand the horrible state of affairs we'll find ourselves in if the government ever gets close to cutting international student numbers by 40%.
Yeah, this is absolutely absurd. So, listeners have probably heard that the federal government's proposed capping student numbers at 40% of total enrolments. Now, let me just say that 40% number is ridiculously high. So Australia currently has by far, well in excess of other countries, the highest concentration of international students in the world. And, the Department of Education data says that at the moment we have 811,000 international students enrolled in Australia. And if you look at the visa data, roughly 1 in 30 people in Australia currently are on either a student visa or a graduate visa. And to put that into perspective, the most international university in the entire United States is the University of Illinois. That is 23% international students. So that's their most international university, whereas the University of Sydney here has just under half, like about 49%. So it's we have an extreme concentration of international students, and it's created a whole lot of problems. So we've seen reports this month that universities have been handing out prestigious degrees to international students who can't speak English. Academics came out complaining that they're not allowed to fail international students, but they've had to bundle these students up with domestic students in group assignments to make sure they pass. There's been heaps of reports on cheating, and even the ABC reported that economics tutorials at Melbourne University have been held in Mandarin, which has left the local students basically not being able to participate. So
Goodness
I
me.
don't think anyone can can argue that this is a good situation. We've also got massive amounts of ghost colleges across Australia, and they're starting to be shut down, which basically offer visas to people that come over to work and they don't actually study. And one of the statistics that constantly gets, trotted out about why we can't cut student numbers is that it's supposedly Australia's fourth biggest export. They say it's a $48 billion export. And I'll tell you, Luke, that is an absolutely fraudulent figure that's published by the ABS. It's complete garbage. And I'll tell you why it's garbage, because the ABS counts all expenditures by students in Australia as an export, even when most of them work here, and most of them pay for their expenses by working in Australia. And that means that by rights, it's not an export. And also, student visas are the only class of visa in Australia other than tourists and holiday makers who are treated as non-residents for the entire duration of the visa. So, for example, if you're a student, a so-called student who comes in on a student visa to attend one of these ghost colleges that doesn't actually do anything, and you drive Ubers for a living and you fill up your car with petrol, that expenditure on petrol is counted as an export. Whereas if you're a skilled, it's counted as an export because they're spending money here, even though it's earned here. But if you're a skilled migrant on a work visa and you fill up with petrol, it's not counted as an export because you're counted as part of the domestic economy. Now, just to totally debunk this $48 billion export figure, you just have to follow the money. So the World Bank produces money on migrant remittance inflows and outflows into Australia. So what those are, it's basically money sent to migrants in Australia from offshore.
Yep.
Versus migrants that are sent, migrants who send money from Australia back to their families. And it turns out that money coming into Australia from migrants is minuscule. So we only had $1.6 billion of US currency. That's the way the World Bank calculates it. In 2013, coming into Australia, but we had $10.3 billion in migrants remittance outflows from Australia.
Goodness.
So that net means that we had a loss of $8.6 billion US in money flowing out of Australia from migrants sending money back to the home countries, for example, India. Now, if international students were a $48 billion export industry, presumably you'd expect more money to be coming into Australia than flowing out of Australia. Yet we have way more money flowing out than flowing in. And that alone tells you that this $48 billion figure that the universities, the Australian Bureau of Statistics calculates, the government, everyone else constantly bangs on about that, that's so valuable, it's literally our fourth biggest export, et cetera, is complete fraud. It's not. International students are far more likely to be an import because they'll come in, they'll work, and then they'll send money back home, which is actually an import. It's not an export. And also our universities pay, roughly, at least for the first year, 15% of their fees they pay back to agents back in India, et cetera. Commissions, that's right, which is an import. So the whole foundation of this international education industry is built on a lie. It's claimed as our fourth biggest export. It's supposedly makes the country heaps of money. It's it's super valuable. We can't dare cut it. When it's actually more likely to be an import because we send so much money out of Australia, which is actually the definition of an import.
Wow. Great information. Good to talk to you, mate. Have a great weekend. I'll catch you next week.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Speak to you next time.
Good on you. Bye-bye. Leith Van Onselen, macrobusiness.com.au. Sometimes, you have these conversations and you end up gobsmacked. What?